Over these last days, that question has been asked, where are we when the three levels of life, existence, mind, have merged seamlessly into the moments of our life, and we're living in a state of intense presence. And those three levels, the nitty-gritty level of cause and effect, the level of the occult or spiritual level, and the level of oneness. But since they're not a state or a place, even though when they're merged they're called Satchit Ananda, to answer the question, perhaps it would be better to phrase it, how do we know? And since it's not a time, a place, or a state, the only way we can do that, it seems, is by recognizing those things that are absent in our life now that were present before. There are two very old and very simple stories that might help us to recognize those absences in our life. And the first is that little story about the Buddha when he's walking along the road with Ananda, his great disciple. And a man coming the other way is impelled to ask the Buddha, or tell the Buddha, only God is real, everything is God. And the Buddha looks at him and said, why, you stupid man, there is no God. And the man is shattered and staggers off down the road. And not further along, they meet another man who also is impelled to ask the Buddha a question. And he says, I'm an atheist and I don't believe in God. And the Buddha looks at him and said, why, you foolish man, there is nothing else but God. God is all. The man is shattered and staggers off down the road. And further along the road, they meet another man. And this man also is drawn to the Buddha. And he says, well, I don't know whether there's a God or whether there is a God. What do you think? And the Buddha fixes him with a piercing gaze and remains completely silent. And the man is shattered and staggers off down the road. And the Buddha and Ananda finally come to their resting place for the evening, and after Ananda has prepared a simple repast for them, and they're sipping their herbal tea, Ananda says to the Buddha, Buddha, Master, I'm troubled. Today, first of all, you say there is no God, and then you say there is nothing else but God, and then you remain silent. I don't understand. And the Buddha said, the answers that were given were for those who asked the question. But if my answers have troubled you, that is your question. And then another story of the Buddha. The Buddha is in retreat in a cave in the mountains with his disciple again, Ananda. And the Buddha is inside the cave in contemplation, and Ananda is outside stirring the rice. When suddenly Ananda sees someone coming up the road, the path of the mountain, and when this being approaches, Ananda is horrified to see that it is Mara. Mara, who tempted the Buddha under the Bodhi tree and was vanquished. The epitome of evil. Ananda was so shocked. What is he doing here in this place? Surely the Buddha will not see him, send him away. So when the Mara approaches, Ananda rather discourteously says, what are you doing here? The Buddha vanquished you some long time ago. You're his enemy. And Mara said, since when did the Buddha have any enemy? And Ananda was very embarrassed because, of course, his master never ever spoke of Mara as an enemy. So what could Ananda do? He had to go into the cave and announce Mara's presence. So when he did, the Buddha rose up from his contemplation, came out of the cave and greeted the Mara, my old friend. How have you been? Haven't seen you for such a long time. Come in, come in. Ananda was horrified. And then the Buddha asks Ananda, please, to bring some herbal tea for them. And Ananda was affronted. He was very happy to serve tea to his master, the Buddha, but Mara. But reluctantly he went out to put on the tureen of water while the Buddha and Ananda went into the cave. But Ananda was out there listening to what it was that was going on inside the cave. And the Mara was saying to the Buddha, after the Buddha asked him how things were going, Mara said, well, I'm tired of being Mara. You've always got to have a scowl on your face, you've always got to pretend to be evil, and I'm tired of it. And anyway, all of my followers now, they're talking about equality, saving the trees and saving the earth, and I'm sick of it. I don't want to be the Mara anymore. Ananda says, well, you think you've got problems. My disciples, they build effigies of me and they take my words and make them into stone and then they interpret them in their own way. So they commiserated with each other for quite some time while they were sipping their herbal tea. And finally, the Mara took his leave and went off down the pathway, leaving Ananda somewhat relieved, because while he was listening to this conversation, he had a great fear that they were going to swap roles, that the Buddha was going to become the Mara and the Mara was going to become the Buddha. But he was left in somewhat of a state of confusion, you might say. So when we listen to these two stories, what are the two things that become apparent in them that it's possible that are now absent in our life that was there before? What does this first story imply about where the Buddha is? One moment stating an absolute, there is no God, and then saying an absolute, there is a God, and then remaining silent. And the Mara and the Buddha, good and evil, what would they indicate that are now absent in our life that might serve to allow us to know where we are. Absence of truth. There's no absolute truth. What do we rest on now? Do you have a ground to stand on?
No.
Do you have some truth, belief that's solid under your feet that you can come back to?
There's no certainty.
Absolutely not. And what about this?
I don't know anything at all.
No. What about this Mara Buddha thing?
Because good and evil are complementary and really part of each other.
Yes.
And there's only one pole.
That's right. So if you sum that up, what would you say? When now good and evil are absent, or merged, as is intimated in this story, what's absent in our life?
Judgment.
Judgment. You're right, you're wrong. This is... Isn't it?
Even what you feel,
No.
it's, it's all that changeable stuff.
Yes.
There's no truth in any of it.
No.
Because it's constantly changing.
Changing. So could it be that these are indicators of what happens for us when the three levels of life or all of movement is merged in this state of intense presence that we find ourselves in? Intense presence that brings with it intense awareness. There's an absence of these things, isn't there? Judgment, truth. What else can we discover? I won't tell you anymore. I won't have any more stories to tell.